Hello. Since January 1974, there has been a series of attacks on women in the Seattle area of Washington state. The suspect wore a mask, sneaked into girls' homes late at night, then used a stick to knock them unconscious and assaulted them. Within 6 months, almost every month, there were reports of missing girls. The suspect also gradually expanded his area of activity, from initial robberies and assaults to murders later on. The victims were all young, beautiful girls, mostly college students with long hair parted in the middle. The suspect always wore a mask when committing crimes and meticulously handled the crime scenes, making police investigations difficult. In June 1974, late one night, a girl named Jorgen Hawkins disappeared in an alley on her way home. The next day, police searched the entire alley but couldn't find her. Witnesses had seen a man with crutches at the place where the girl disappeared that night. The man was holding a briefcase and had a cast on his leg. Due to limited clues, the police could not find the man. Jorgen's relatives were journalists. After learning about the incident, they published related articles that attracted public attention. It turned out that throughout the past 6 months in Seattle, there had been consecutive cases of missing young women, causing great concern among local residents. The police compiled information on some of the missing women and discovered that the times of their disappearances coincided with exam periods at local universities. Most of the disappearance locations were near construction sites. Many witnesses saw a man with a cast on his leg driving a Volkswagen Beetle. Because the details of the cases were similar, the police suspected that the perpetrator might be the same person. On July 14, 1974, a month later, 5 young girls were vacationing on the beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington. At that time, a handsome man wearing a white tennis outfit approached them. One of his arms was bandaged, and he introduced himself as Ted. Because his arm was injured, he wanted to ask the 5 of them to help him load a sailboat onto his car. 4 of them refused, but an 18-year-old girl enthusiastically agreed to help him. So she followed the man to his car, but then she discovered there was no sailboat in the car. She had also heard about the recent series of disappearances in the area. So sensing something was wrong, she immediately turned and ran to a crowded place. Her vigilance helped the girl luckily escape. Also on that day, 2 more girls were reported missing in the park. Many witnesses had seen a suspicious man with a bandaged arm. The police drew a sketch of the suspect based on witness descriptions and posted it all over the streets of Seattle. The police also received hundreds of tips every day. One of them pointed to the same suspect. That person was Ted Bundy, 28 years old, a local university student with excellent grades and no prior criminal record. Indeed, the police also found 8 witnesses from that day at the park and showed them photos of Ted. However, 7 out of 8 of them said it wasn't him. The police also thought that people like Ted were unlikely to commit crimes, and because there was no evidence, they released him. In fact, when he was in high school, he had been arrested many times for theft, but when he became an adult, those criminal records were erased for unknown reasons. Sometime later, a hiker reported to the police that he had discovered a skeleton 3 kilometers from Lake Sammamish State Park. After receiving the report, the police went there and found 2 more skeletons. In total, there were 3 skeletons. It was confirmed that they were all girls who had been reported missing recently. One of them was the missing college student Jorgen. After the consecutive cases in Seattle, there were also many cases of missing women in Salt Lake City, Utah. At that time, the bodies of 2 naked girls were found in the forest. The victims had many bruises and signs of assault. They may have been assaulted after death. The cause of death was suffocation. The suspect was very careful and cleaned the crime scenes very thoroughly, so the police obtained very little evidence. At that time, police in different states in the U.S. did not exchange information, so they did not know that the consecutive cases in Seattle, Washington, and the recent consecutive cases in Salt Lake City were actually committed by the same person. On November 8, 1974, late that night while it was raining lightly, a girl suddenly rushed into the police station in Salt Lake City, Utah, to report a crime. The girl's name was Carol Duranch, 18 years old, a telephone operator. She said that after work that day, she was planning to drive to the bookstore to read books. At that time, a handsome guy came over. He claimed to be a police officer and said that someone was trying to steal her car. Carol didn't know how he had found her, but she still decided to follow the man to the parking lot. On the way, Carol became suspicious and asked to see his ID, but the man just smiled and ignored her. When they arrived at the parking lot, Carol discovered that her car was indeed missing. The man then suggested that the car may have been towed and asked her to go to a nearby security checkpoint to file a report. Carol hesitated for a moment, but because she was anxious to get her car back, she went with the man to a secluded building nearby. But they still couldn't find the car. The man then said the car may have been taken to the police station and that he could drive her there. On the way, Carol noticed that the direction of the car was not towards the police station. She realized something was wrong and asked to get out of the car. The man slowly pulled over. At that moment, the man suddenly grabbed her hand, pulled out a gun, pointed it at her head, and threatened to kill her. However, Carol opened the door, jumped out of the car, and ran away. Coincidentally, at that moment, another car was passing by. She immediately stopped the car and asked them to take her to the police station to report the incident. After some investigation, the police found several suspects, including Ted Bundy. Carol immediately recognized him from the photos of some suspects, and the police's suspicion of Ted increased further. Back in Washington, the police received a call from Elizabeth Klopfer, Ted Bundy's girlfriend. This was not the first time she had reported to the police. A few months earlier, she had reported about a disappearance at Lake Sammamish State Park. But at that time, the police did not take it seriously. After learning about the disappearances in Salt Lake City, Utah, she again reported to the police about her boyfriend, Ted Bundy. This time, the police opened an investigation into him and discovered that Ted's travel trajectory matched the locations of the disappearances. But other than that, there was no other evidence. On August 16, 1975, while patrolling on the road, a Utah police officer accidentally discovered a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly and leisurely in a residential area, looking very suspicious. After noticing the patrolling police, he immediately changed direction and tried to escape, but was blocked by the police car. The police found that the passenger seat of the Volkswagen Beetle had been removed. There was a ski mask, crowbar, handcuffs, rope, and other tools in the car. And the driver was Ted. He said the ski mask was for skiing, the handcuffs he had picked up from a trash can, and the rest were just ordinary, everyday items. Tonight, he wanted to go see a movie, so he was just passing by here. The police officer expressed doubt about Ted's answer. After notifying the command center, the police officers learned that Ted was involved in some major cases, so they took him to the police station. Investigators searched his residence but found nothing. Ted was later released due to lack of evidence. To solve the case, Washington police compiled files on all recently missing girls and compiled detailed information. They also listed suspects, with Ted Bundy's name on that list. Ted Bundy was born in November 1946. His real name was Theodore Cowell. Ted's mother had gotten pregnant with him when she was unmarried. Ted's biological father did not take responsibility and left them. Ted's mother's family was Christian and did not like people who got pregnant out of wedlock. After giving birth to the child at a home for unwed mothers, the mother left him there. Ted's grandfather could not bear to see his grandson like that, so he took Ted home to Philadelphia and raised him as a son. To avoid rumors from the outside world, he asked the family not to reveal Ted's identity. Of course, young Ted did not know that the father raising him was actually his grandfather. Ted's grandfather was a violent, paranoid, and severely racist man. He often used violence to solve problems. Under his influence, Ted exhibited some strange behaviors from a young age. For example, when his family was taking a nap, he would run into the kitchen, take a knife, place it next to his family, then stand by the bed, smiling with satisfaction. Ted's grandfather liked to read porn magazines and randomly placed them around Ted when he was young, who would often look through them. In 1950, when Ted was 4 years old, his mother took him away from Philadelphia and moved to Western Washington. A year later, in 1951, the mother married a man and had 4 children, one after another. However, Ted could not integrate into this new family. In high school, Ted was withdrawn and did not like to interact with others. He often wandered the streets alone, rummaging through trash cans hoping to find discarded porn magazines. Sometimes he would lie on other people's windows late at night, watching women bathing inside. He also liked to read some detective and crime novels. In 1965, 19-year-old Ted entered the University of Puget Sound in southern Seattle. Ted then continued his studies at the University of Washington in downtown Seattle. While in college, Ted began a relationship with a girl named Stephanie Brooks. Stephanie came from a wealthy family. Her family did not think highly of Ted. For this reason, Ted dropped out of college and became a driver and bodyguard for government agencies. He wanted to pursue a political career, but young Ted was a bit ambitious and wanted to achieve success quickly. His girlfriend felt Ted was not mature enough and her family didn't like him much, so she broke up with Ted. This dealt a heavy blow to Ted's psychology. This was a major turning point in his life. Ted was very sad after the breakup. For some unknown reason, he suddenly became curious about his identity, so he went to investigate. However, after checking, Ted was shocked to discover that the father who had raised him was actually his grandfather. The sadness of the breakup had not ended when Ted suffered another psychological blow. To relieve his frustration, he went to Colorado and other places. In the fall of 1969, 23-year-old Ted returned to Washington State and dated a 24-year-old single mother named Elizabeth Klopfer. The following year, Ted returned to the University of Washington and continued studying psychology. Ted had a high IQ, excellent academic performance, and was warmly received by university professors. After graduating, Ted went to work at a crisis center in Seattle. There, a specialist named Ann Rule, along with a former Seattle police officer, shared with Ted some police methods for handling criminals. This provided valuable experience for Ted's subsequent crimes. Energized, Ted again participated in politics, helping the current governor defeat his opponents and beginning a short political career. In 1973, at the age of 27, Ted began studying law at the University of Washington Law School at the suggestion of the governor and university professors. Ted was very handsome, charming, young, ambitious, and had unlimited potential. At that time, Ted was in his prime and had reconnected with his ex-girlfriend Stephanie. She was also very surprised by Ted's changes over the past few years, and the two soon rekindled their romance. But Ted and Elizabeth still maintained a relationship. Neither girl knew of the other's existence. After dating Stephanie for a while, Ted proposed to her. Stephanie was very happy about it and began introducing Ted to friends as her fiancé. Just as the two were preparing to get married, Ted suddenly cut off all contact with Stephanie. She couldn't even get in touch with Ted. This made her very sad, and all of this was planned by Ted Bundy. Ted's purpose was to take revenge for the breakup years ago. Going back to the past, in the fall of 1969, 24-year-old Elizabeth was living alone in Seattle with her child. She met Ted in a bar near the university. The two chatted in the bar that night and spent the night together. The next morning, Ted personally made breakfast for Elizabeth. Such a man made Elizabeth very admiring. For a time, the two often went out together. Ted was very good to Elizabeth's daughter. Sometimes on weekends, he would come home early to take care of his daughter, very much like a father. Elizabeth came from a wealthy family in Utah. Her father was a doctor. After dating for a while, she brought Ted home to meet her parents. Ted's elegant manner left a good impression on Elizabeth's family. Ted felt ashamed of his life experiences. He had such a past and was determined to enter politics or the upper class. During the 5 years with Ted, Elizabeth had gotten pregnant once while Ted was still in college. To not affect his studies, Elizabeth chose to have an abortion. As time passed, Elizabeth discovered that Ted often dated other girls without letting her know. To retaliate against Ted, she even dated another man with the purpose of making Ted jealous. But Ted didn't care. In the end, she could only use alcohol to drown her sorrows. She didn't want to leave him. In early 1974, many girls began to disappear in the Seattle area. The police released a sketch of the suspect to the public. When she saw the sketch, Elizabeth felt it looked very similar to her boyfriend Ted Bundy. During this time, Ted did not live with Elizabeth, but lived in another rented house nearby, having the conditions to commit crimes. After 2 disappearances, Elizabeth began to suspect and asked Ted where he had been on those days, but he hesitated and was vague, not wanting to answer. In the suspect information released by the police, it was mentioned that the suspect drove a Volkswagen Beetle, and Ted's car was also a Volkswagen Beetle. Once by chance, Elizabeth accidentally found a crowbar in Ted's car. Not only that, she also found a pair of crutches, a bag of plaster, and a bag of women's underwear in Ted's residence. After seeing these items, Elizabeth wanted to know the truth, so she confronted Ted. Unexpectedly, Ted directly threatened that if she dared to tell others, he would not let her off. However, Elizabeth still told a close friend about the incident. Under the persuasion of her close friend, she mustered up the courage and called the police. But this was just her word, without concrete evidence. The police received similar reports almost every day, so initially they did not pay much attention. In 1975, Ted had gone to Salt Lake City, Utah, where another attack on women occurred. Elizabeth felt this could not be a coincidence and must have been Ted, so she reported to the police again. This time, the police came to Elizabeth and asked her for some information. Judging from recent cases, the suspect may have a severe sexual addiction. Therefore, the investigators asked Elizabeth some personal questions about Ted's sex life. She said Ted had some sexual fetishes, and he also liked to read books and newspapers about it. The police became more suspicious of Ted from this. The next step was to find evidence. In September 1975, Ted sold his Volkswagen Beetle. After obtaining this lead, the police immediately seized the car and conducted a detailed investigation. As a result, many hairs were found in the car. The test results showed that they belonged to 3 victims in the series of cases: Melissa Smith, Karen Campbell, and Carol DeRanch, who reported to the police at the beginning of the video. Melissa went missing in Utah and was found dead 17 days later with bruises, trauma from strong impacts to the head, and signs of sexual assault. Karen was a professional nurse who disappeared while on vacation in Colorado and was found a month later on a remote road. She was naked, had many open wounds on her body, and had been sexually assaulted. Although the locations of these 3 cases were different, their hairs were all found in Ted's car. The Washington State Police established contact with police in several other states. After exchanging information about some cases, they finally discovered that the cases occurring in many places above may have been committed by the same person, and that person was Ted Bundy. With important evidence in hand, the police arrested Ted, but he denied guilt and insisted he was innocent. Because the evidence the prosecutor had was still limited, it was very difficult to win the case if relying only on hair. Therefore, the prosecutor could only charge Ted with kidnapping charges. In February 1976, the trial officially began, and witness Carol DeRanch testified in court. She firmly stated that the defendant, Ted Bundy, was the one who tried to kidnap her that night. Because of the important hair evidence found in Ted's car, the court declared the defendant, Ted Bundy, guilty of kidnapping and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. After the sentencing, prosecutors continued to charge Ted with 2 first-degree murder charges for Melissa and Karen. Ted was then transferred to Colorado for trial. On June 7, 1977, the trial was held at the Picken County Court in Colorado. Ted had requested to act as his own lawyer to defend himself, and the judge agreed. They unshackled Ted from his handcuffs and chains. Serious cases like this usually require multiple trials, with each trial being very long. Ted had gone to the library on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, claiming to research information, and wandered between the bookshelves. But when no one was paying attention, he lunged toward a window and jumped out. This caused Ted to sprain his ankle, but he was still able to walk. After leaving the courthouse, he went through Aspen, heading south towards Aspen Mountain, where Ted stole food, clothes, and a rifle from a cabin on the mountain before heading deeper into the wilderness. After 2 days on the run, he had moved to Lake Meredith, where he stole food and clothes from a camper before continuing to flee. On June 13, 1977, after 6 days on the run, Ted could no longer endure the cold weather and his worsening leg injury. He decided to steal a car and return to Aspen for treatment. He was then spotted on the road by 2 patrol officers and arrested. Ted was then taken to Garfield County Jail. Ted's lawyer and friends said that the current evidence from the prosecution could not prove his guilt. As long as he stayed calm, he could still be found not guilty. But Ted also knew the law and had his own ideas. At that time, he had already planned an escape in his mind. However, escaping was extremely difficult and he could not succeed alone. Ted then remembered a friend named Carol Boone. She was a former colleague of Ted's and had been in love with him for a long time. During a prison visit, Carol secretly gave Ted some money, and Ted sold it to another inmate for $500. Ted then used the money to buy a hacksaw and a blueprint of the prison. He used his daily shower time to use the hacksaw to cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell. Above the cell was a ventilation duct, but Ted discovered it was very narrow and he couldn't fit through at his current size. Ted then lost 16 kilograms through dieting and finally was able to fit into the ventilation duct. Every night, Ted climbed into the ventilation duct to explore. Other inmates heard sounds coming from above and reported it to the guards. However, The guards thought it might be the sound of rats passing by, so they didn't pay much attention. Ted spent many nights exploring the ventilation ducts. Although he couldn't find a way out of the prison, he did find the warden's office. At that time, a new plan was forming in Ted's mind. On December 30th, 1977, it was still Christmas Day. Many guards were still at home for Christmas. This was the most lax time of year for prisons. That day, 31-year-old Ted began his escape. He placed a pile of books on the bed in his cell and covered them with a blanket. From the outside, it looked like a man sleeping under the blanket. Then he crawled into the ventilation duct above the ceiling. He moved little by little, afraid he would make a sound and be discovered. Finally, he reached the warden's office. Ted continued to put on the warden's uniform, then walked out of the prison gate in a grand manner. By noon the next day, when the guards patrolled, they discovered Ted had escaped from prison. By that time, Ted had moved to Chicago. After Ted escaped from prison, the FBI also launched a nationwide manhunt for him. After Ted arrived in Chicago, he stayed there for a short time before heading to Florida. He rented a room near Florida State University and wanted to hide his identity there to find work. But because he couldn't use his real identity, he had to resort to theft. He then committed many assaults and murders in the area. The victims were all young, beautiful girls. On February 12, 1978, more than a month after escaping, Ted didn't have a penny left and couldn't pay rent, so he stole another car and started to flee. 3 days later, on February 15, 1978, in the early morning, he was stopped by police in the car. They found ID cards of many female students, many stolen credit cards, and a stolen TV. In 1979, 33-year-old Ted had to appear in court in Florida. To maintain a good image before the jury, Ted had asked Carol Boone, a single mother who was in love with him, to testify in court and lie. Carol believed Ted was innocent from the beginning to the end. The evidence held by the prosecutors was insufficient, so they proposed a plea deal that did not require the death penalty. That is, Ted had to admit to killing 3 victims and apologize to their families. However, Ted only saw the plea deal as a way to avoid the death penalty. But Ted only wanted more time to find legal loopholes and possibly appeal. Ted then apologized to the victims' families and finally rejected the plea deal. In June 1979, the trial began. Hundreds of media outlets were waiting outside the courthouse. During the trial, witnesses for the prosecution said they had seen Ted take out the murder weapon and appear at the crime scene. In addition, bite marks were found on the left buttock of one of the victims. Experts compared the bite marks and found they were identical to Ted Bundy's teeth. After more than a month of trial, on July 24, 1979, the case came to an end. The court convicted the defendant, Ted Bundy, of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. The above case caused a sensation across the United States and attracted a lot of public attention. Ted Bundy was handsome and charming. His supporters did not believe he would do that. Some even sent love letters and gifts to Ted in prison. In January 1980, another murder trial related to Ted was held in Orlando. During the trial, Ted's supporters came from all over the United States. Some people gave love letters to Ted's defense lawyer. At that time, Ted had completely become a star. A woman said in an interview with reporters that Ted seemed incapable of such things. Notably, during the trial, there was an incident where Ted proposed to Carol Duranche in front of the judge. It turned out that after Ted went to prison, Carol had asked Ted to marry her to have a stronger relationship. Ted had also made that request to the prison management, but was refused. Carol told Ted that she knew a secret law in Florida that if Ted proposed to her in front of a judge, they could legally marry. That's why Ted did it in court. In the above case, the jury deliberated for 8 hours and reached a result. They unanimously declared Ted guilty, and the result was that the court sentenced Ted to death. During the trial period, Carol frequently visited the prison and bribed the guards to have the opportunity to be alone with Ted in prison, and later she became pregnant. After the trial, Ted began a lengthy appeal process. A reporter interviewed him, but he was very careful in answering and avoided mentioning some important issues. He revealed his initial crimes and changes in his thinking through third-person narrative. At first, he killed people just for property, but later desire became the main reason. To avoid being reported by victims, he then proceeded to kill them. Ted had contacted an FBI crime analyst and a biographer. That person was shocked by the satisfaction Ted described about the murders. Ted considered himself an amateur in the early days and only started serial killing in 1974. However, he was not willing to reveal the details of the cases from beginning to end. In July 1984, guards found 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Ted's cell and suspected he was trying to escape. They inspected the cell and discovered that the steel bar on the cell window had been sawed through and glued back with homemade glue. They then transferred Ted to another cell. A few months later, guards again found unauthorized mirrors in his cell, and Ted was transferred again. In October 1984, Robert Keppel, one of the key investigators in Ted's case in 1984, began investigating the Green River Killer case. After Ted learned about the case, he analyzed the psychological activities of the Green River Killer in his letter and conducted a psychological profile of the perpetrator, hoping to help the police solve the case. The purpose was to avoid the death penalty. By 1986, Ted's execution date had been set for January 1989. Ted had exhausted all means of appeal. As time passed, the evidence against Ted grew. At that time, he could have avoided the death penalty if he had signed the plea agreement, but now it was too late. Ted voluntarily confessed to all the crimes he had committed, but he refused to describe the related details, trying to delay the execution of the death penalty by this method. One of Ted's supporters was Diana Weiner. Since Ted was sentenced to death, she had lobbied the families of some victims, hoping they would plead with the governor of Florida, but their families flatly refused. The families of the victims said they no longer wanted Ted to confess, but only wanted him to be executed as soon as possible. The state governor said he would not delay Ted's execution date and criticized the behavior of his supporters. Ted had not confessed since being arrested and did not admit to committing at least 30 murders until he actually faced the death penalty. Ted said he wasn't sure how many people he had killed. On the evening before he was electrocuted, Ted reviewed some victims across states with the police officer. In Washington, 11 people, including 3 unidentified. In Utah, 8 people, 3 unidentified. In Colorado, 3 people. In Florida, 3 people. In Oregon, 2 people, both unidentified. In Idaho, 2 people, 1 unidentified. In California, 1 person, unidentified. Among them, there were some notable cases. At midnight on January 4, 1974, Ted entered the basement apartment of an 18-year-old student named Karen Sparks. After knocking her unconscious with a metal rod from the bed frame, he used that same rod to assault her and cause severe internal injuries. The girl miraculously survived and was unconscious for 10 days, along with injuries that followed her for life. In the early morning of February 1st of the same year, Ted broke into the room of Linda Ann Healy, a student in charge of broadcasting snow reports for skiers. He knocked Healy unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans with a white blouse and a pair of boots, then took her away. On August 2, 1974, he assaulted and strangled a hitchhiker in Idaho, then immediately disposed of her in a nearby river. On October 2, 1974, he kidnapped 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Her body was buried near Capitol Reef National Park. On October 31, 1974, he abducted a 17-year-old girl named Rhonda Stapley after she left a cafe. After assaulting her, he dumped her body in American Fork Canyon. At 7:16 a.m. on January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy, 42 years old, was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison, ending his criminal life. After learning of Ted's death, hundreds of people cheered on the grass opposite the prison. Some sang, some set off fireworks. Everyone celebrated because that disgusting bastard had been sentenced to death. Ted's supporters were very distressed after hearing the news, and some women suffered nervous breakdowns after learning of Ted's death. As for the 3 girls who had relationships with Ted, first, his ex-girlfriend Stephanie had married someone else right after being revenged by Ted. Elizabeth finally saw Ted's true face after he was imprisoned and quickly married someone else. As for Carol, after learning that Ted had confessed, she finally realized how deeply she had been deceived. She took her children and began living under an assumed name. Ted's story has been adapted into many films in the decades since. Ironically, he killed many girls, but became the serial killer most admired by girls in the United States. Today's video ends here, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.